I've been going around the house for like 15 minutes trying to find the best lighting, and I think I found it. And this was apparently the best I could find. I am standing at the foot of the stairs for the second floor, so yeah, not the most comfortable for my legs, but let's go with it. I just want to share with you my pin before we start this really lengthy video. Here it is. It is from Spirited Away. And now that those important things are out of the way, let's get into this video that, as the title suggests, is gonna be a really lengthy TBR. I have already explained in a few videos before that I am kind of setting up different TBRs, probably for the rest of next year as well, just to mix up genres, because I get bored of one genre. So having multiple TBR, I can mix up the books and then I can wrap them up together. Now this TBR is directly linked to the video I've done regarding fantasy genre, recommending a book that I already read in every fantasy genre in existence. Now the video I link up here and down below. That video was inspired by Daniel Green channel. I'm gonna link his channel down below, where he basically explained all the kind of genre that fantasy had, sci-fi and fantasy. Basically took that video, which was really informative, so definitely check him out. And I made a recommendation based on that, and then I decided that, you know what, I've not read enough books in each of his subgenres of fantasy. I want to read them all, so this is what it is today. It is a TBR where I'm going to read a book in each subgenre of fantasy, and I'm going to wrap them up a later date, I guess. There is around 33 subgenres, so 33 books in this TBR, so it's going to be lengthy. Get a snack, get your lunch or dinner, whatever. We're gonna be here a while. And last disclaimer before I actually start, these books, subgenres of fantasy, can be interchangeable a lot of times. A book can be in different subgenres, so I chose most of my books for my physical TBR, so I chose books that I already owned, apart from a couple that I had to buy. All the other 33 books, so around 31 books I had and I wanted to read. I'm trying to tackle the books I already own and have not read, which all these TBRs give me a chance to do so. So a book could potentially be in 3, 4 subgenres, even 5 or all of subgenres, sometimes, really rarely. But I chose a book for each subgenre, so there are no double if you want. But I am well aware that these books can fit in more than one subgenre. Without further ado, I'm gonna list the same genre in the same order that I did in the other video. I'm gonna be as brief as possible with the synopsis of the book, just because this is gonna be like lunch and dinner or otherwise, and I just prefer to keep it just as one lengthy meal. Let's go. Sorry for the change of perspective, but I had to move my phone up or I'd be without legs in like a matter of minutes. Alternative history. So at one point the author made history take another turn from what really happened, and you have alternative history. I actually have looked at lists for each subgenre just to make sure that these books would fit in that category. So if they are not fitting that category, don't blame me. I am blameless. You see why I've done that? We got Victorian London with its politics and all of that, but werewolves and supernatural creatures as well roaming around. We got a count and we got Victoria. Victoria, she is of noble birth, and she's got these special weird powers where basically when she's around, supernatural creatures lose their power. She's not really like a hunter or anything of the sort. She's really like a noble woman, kind of getting a lot of trouble and having this kind of relationship with this werewolf count. So the second book is the third book in the series. I think there are 5 books in total. Second book left on a cliffhanger. Looking forward to continuing on the series, I should say. I'm not nearly there to finish this, but I couldn't find in my TBR any better alternative history. I mean, I wanted to read this as well, so I know it's a bit of a stretch, this, but it is alternative history at the end of the day. Fantasy based on Arthurian legend. I couldn't get it wrong with The Forest House by Marion Zimmer Bradley. This is the second book in a series by Bradley, where basically it's all based on Arthurian legend, and I think you start before Arthur is even born, and I think it's quite a lengthy series. I've read the first book many eons ago, so I don't remember what happens, but I think all the books are kind of self-contained. I might be completely wrong about this, but I've heard that the second book was really, really good. I think the first one I wasn't too impressed. Not read many Arthurian fantasy at all, and again I had this on my TBR, so I mean, this is right, this fits this category and no one can tell me it doesn't. Fantasy with an assassin as main protagonist. Again, I had this from my TBR for ages, and this is Great Mercy by Robin Lefevre. And again, this is about this girl that is being trained to be an assassin nun, which I really hope it does it better than the Netflix TV show, which I kind of DNF'd. But yeah, I've heard amazing things about this. It is kind of an old book, it was kind of popular back then. Looking forward to this. We got an assassin, she is a nun. The two things don't really, I mean, I'm curious to see how they do it. Fantasy based on Christianity, or you know, taking elements of Christianity in it. I almost was tempted, and I found in a list, to be fair, of going and reread The Exorcist, but then I remember that I own this, which is Paradise Lost by John Milton, which is also considered a classic, I'd say, definitely. And this is all told in verses, so, but it's like classic verses, so it's gonna be like when I read the Divine Comedy, it's gonna be lengthy read, it's not gonna be an easy read, and there is a lot of you looking up words and understanding what a sentence means, so it's not gonna be an easy one. And I think this is the Bible retold by the devil, something like the sort, which sounds so bloody cool. And it does fit Christian fantasy. I mean, you know, what is more Christian than the devil? Also, before I continue on, I'm not including comics in this. There is no comics in this, but stay tuned because I might do a similar thing with just comics and manga, but I might, I don't know. In this specific video, I want to tackle my TBR, my books. It's fantasy where there is a lot of humor in it, and honestly, I could have chosen like one of my Terry Pratchett books. Definitely would fit this category, but I am so looking forward to continue on with this series. This is by TJ Klune. The third book is called The Consumption of Magic. There are 4 books in total, and this is, I think, The Tales of Verania is called the series, something like that. This, together with the Disco Ward series, is one of the most humoristic fantasy series I've ever read. I love the humor, it's not for everybody in this. It's really full of sexual content, while the Disco Ward is definitely not. If you want to read something more mild, I would say definitely go to the Disco Ward. But if you don't read this, you're missing out. And this is a fantasy where you got the main protagonist is training to be a wizard for the prince. He hates the prince guts because the prince is betrothed to the captain of the guards, and our protagonist Sam is in love with the captain of the guards, and there is a really weird love triangle. We got also gay unicorn, giant, which are the best friends of Sam. This is hilarious. There are a lot of LGBTQ plus elements in it, and it's so funny. It's so bloody funny. Like I laughed so much with this, and I cannot wait to continue on. It's just hilarious, absurd, but really in a good, amazing way, and I really cherish this series. Fantasy series where our protagonist is really young and we follow them growing up. And with these, I chose Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. I owned this beautiful paperback for ages, and I wanted to read it for ages. This could also be considered assassin fantasy, I guess, as we got the bastard son of the king being raised in the stable by the castle fool, and all of a sudden he has to train to become an assassin and potentially save the kingdom, I believe. I don't know much. I think this is a really lengthy series, divided in sub-series, basically. And definitely we start at a point where our main protagonist is young, and then we kind of follow him while he grows up. Court intrigue fantasy. Fantasy based on court intrigue, Game of Thrones, all those kind of things, but of course I've already read that. So I chose Three Dark Crowns by Kendall Blake. I've heard mixed things about these. I wanted to, because I owned it, give it a try and see if I want to read this. If not, bye-bye. When it comes down to court intrigue, is one of my favorite things, so I've read most of the things that were reading the list I've already read, and this came up. It's a YA fantasy. I prefer definitely adult fantasy, but I'm still reading and enjoy a lot of YA fantasy, so I had this and chose this. And this is about these three girls that were raised to be queens. However, just one of them can become queen, and whoever becomes queen is the one who killed off the other sisters, basically something of a sort. And yeah, sounds promising. Yeah, you know, murder of your own siblings. Sounds promising. Fantasy that's really dark with heavy topics and is really brutal as well. It's pretty similar to grim dark fantasy. However, I think in this you don't necessarily follow like an anti-hero, you're just following a story where a lot of bad things happen, basically. And this was the perfect excuse to continue on with the Malazan Book of the Fallen by Steve Erickson. This is book 2, Dead House Gates. I really enjoyed the first one. Epic fantasy. I don't remember the synopsis. It's just about, I think it's also military fantasy. It's based on conquering and, you know, kingdom at wars, and you got a bunch of characters that you follow, and it's really complex, dark story. So this is a brick, and I cannot wait. I'm really happy to continue this series. And again, not much else to say. I think this takes place for many years after the events of book 1. I'm gonna find something to refresh my memory regarding book 1, continue on. And yeah, this is a weird cover, we can all agree. It's just a bit weird. Fantasy where there are dragons and they are quite prominent in the story, not necessarily, but fantasy with dragons. And then I chose A Natural History of Dragons by Mary Brennan, and this is written as a memoir of this lady who were kind of not Victorian era, but not in modern times, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. But basically she goes and studies dragons, because dragons are species, and she's kind of a biologist, something of a sort, regarding dragons. So I mean, can we appreciate this cover? I bought this because of the cover, I'm not gonna lie. I really like dragons, but I'm not too much into dragon fantasy, so I'm kind of curious to see how they tackle this, because this doesn't sound like an epic fantasy with, you know, dragons being mean or, you know, dragon riders. It's more about these scientists basically studying dragons, so it's gonna be interesting. A big chunk of the books that I just mentioned could be fit into the category of high fantasy. High fantasy is a fantasy that mainly doesn't take place in any part of a known world, so the author has created his own world, basically his own map and all of that, and usually it's more than one book, usually. For this I chose Brandon Sanderson, World of Radiance. So in England they divide this in two, which is really sad. I hate when they do this. I prefer to have just like a big chunk of a book, don't mind, but these I mean, they thank God put the first one in a huge one, so I was lucky, but I couldn't find the second one. And I really like the covers though, so I wanted to buy the, you know, matching covers for the one I already own and read. Really high fantasy, military fantasy as well, I would say. And you got a world that it's at war after they try to make peace with the other species, and these other species betrayed them, and now they've been at war with these other species for many years. And I'm gonna link down below, whenever it's ready, my wrap up for the first book, where I explain a little bit more what I thought about the series. But overall I really enjoyed it, and the ending is really the strongest point, I would say. And I heard that the second book is even better than the first, so this was a perfect excuse to continue on this series. Fantasy where there is a lot of sex or a lot of sexual content, I would say. Now with this I had a bit of a trouble, meaning that I didn't have on my physical TBR any erotic fantasy. However, I have this is by Angela Carter, and it's the Bloody Chamber. This is a collection of short stories based on fables, Red Riding Hood, Snow White, all of those kind of fables, but they are retold in a kind of horror slash erotic way. So what I've read, it's just, it's really sexy, and it's also kind of disturbing, which I mean, it's a good combination, I believe, to a certain degree, if it's well handled. So let's see. I've heard great things about this. It's really short, which, yes. And I don't know, I'm not reading too much into short stories usually, although, you know, this might surprise me in a good way. Hopefully, I am gonna, for just give you a bit of a hint, I might do a kind of haul in the future based on this again. It's gonna be fun looking for an erotic fantasy, I guess, to buy. Fantasy that's based again on fables, you know, the stories that we were told as children, or children's stories based, or like fables, you know, green fables, all that kind of things. And for these, I actually decided to read The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I'm pretty sure I'm butchering this. I found this on Book Depository, I believe, and I went with this. First of all, I found this in a list of, you know, fable fantasy based books. Yes, I've read these when I was a really young child, probably maybe even my grandma or my mom read this to me, or maybe I just perused through the pages when I was a child, but I don't remember absolutely anything about these. And I don't know what it's about. I think it's about a child who recounts fairy tales, so again, almost fables if you want, and I think it fits perfectly. Again, I didn't want to go with a retelling at the moment, as I already had that one that I just showed you, and I thought this was the perfect occasion. And also there are illustrations inside, and just a beautiful copy. I think it's perfect. Fantasy that takes place in, you know, Victorian era and Renaissance, I believe. Now, the book I'm gonna show you, it could be, technically speaking, literary exchange for Blameless, the first book of alternative history, as this is also an alternative history. It's also vampire fantasy, but this is Anno Dracula by Mr. Tim Newman. So this takes place in 1888. So yeah, I found this on the list, I guess, of Gaslamp Fantasy, so it didn't come up with this himself. But it's also alternative history, because we got Queen Victoria, who marries actually Dracula, yes, the famous Vlad Tepes, and people started becoming vampires in London. And then also there is like a serial killer on the loose, and I think a bunch of characters, including vampires, are gonna go on a hunt for this killer. Really sounds similar to Jack the Ripper, and sounds amazing. I'm really looking forward to this. It's a dark fantasy where you follow basically the bad guy or the anti-hero or really young and likable character, and in this instance I chose The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. I love Joe Abercrombie writing. I was looking for an excuse to read this, basically, as it didn't come up with my TBR previously. I don't know what it is about, but I know it's really grim dark, as his writing usually is, and you follow definitely not a hero. Fantasy based on firearms, basically. It's where there is an element of combat or war where there are firearms. That's the meaning I take it. It's, you know, we're not using swords, we're using actually guns and rifles and all that. And I chose the second book in this series by Brian McKellen, Gunpowder Mage trilogy, something like that. And this is the Crimson Campaign, book 2. Again, it's a trilogy with a sequel series, if I'm not mistaken, and in this you follow a bunch of characters. It's definitely military fantasy where you got people that have powers related to gunpowder, so they might have powers that help them, you know, shoot a farther distance, or powers that have to do with actually the powder itself, the gunpowder itself. It's a bit weird. Definitely military fantasy I've not read before. I really enjoyed the first book. It was definitely a solid 4 stars. Not really easy to find gunpowder fantasy, I believe, so thank God for these. Hero fantasy, you've got a hero and you've got the hero against a dark lord, bad guy, whatever you want to call it. And the Wheel of Time, The Eye of the World, is the first book in this Robert Jordan series. Super hyper famous, and to be fair, I've read fantasy all my life, and I'm pretty sure this was kind of famous where I am from, so in Italy. But to be fair, it wasn't as promoted as other stuff that I've read in the genre. I don't know why, and so I never read it because I was reading tons of fantasy. But I remember the library full of Harry Potter and Game of Thrones, which yes, but my love for Game of Thrones started in Italy when I read the books. But this was not promoted as well, or maybe it was promoted when I was still too young. I think there is a TV show coming out at one point, and it's a chunk of a book. We've got a hero, we've got a bad guy, we've got a bunch of characters to follow. I don't know anything else. I don't want to know anything else. I am bloody late, I know, but I read it. Where the magic is not prominent at all, is more like hinted, or is not more in the background. And when I went on the list, I found this, The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden, which it was going around booktube a lot a year ago. Basically, I've heard great things, and apparently this takes place in like Siberia or Russia. And this is a low fantasy, meaning that I believe they live in like this small village with a lot of folklore tales and all of that, but I don't really believe in the stories. And then we got our main character who actually can see spirits or something of the sort, but I think it's more on the tame side of magic and all of this kind of things. I've heard it's really beautiful written and lyrical. Hopefully I love it. Many of these subgenres sounds like exactly the same to each other, but anyway, I chose the Windup bird Chronicle by Murakami. I had some trouble finding like a fantasy that would fit these. This is not necessarily a fantasy, it's a magic realism that kind of borders into fantasy. I found this on a list, so again, don't hold a grudge against me if you think this shouldn't be in a magic realism fantasy subcategory. But this about this man, one day his cat got lost and he goes on a crazy journey to find it. I've read one Murakami before, Norwegian Wood, was the 3 stars. I wasn't too impressed, so I've heard this though it's one of his best, and definitely his writing was intriguing enough for me to say maybe you didn't particularly appreciate this story, but you might appreciate something else. Hopefully this will redeem him and start a whole love for Murakami. Place in medieval times, and finally I can get around to read The Princess Bride by William Goldman, and this is really popular and not as much where I come from. I didn't watch the movie or anything of the sort, and then I came here and then I heard thousands of people talking about this and the movie, and I need to read it. I've literally not heard one person on earth speaking badly about this book, and I think it's about a pirate, a prince, and a princess bride. Well, obviously. So I'm gonna read it and hopefully I'm gonna really love it. Hopefully. Takes place in medieval time. I checked. So just pretty self-explanatory. It's a fantasy with a lot of military elements in it. Bunch of other books I just mentioned could fit this category, but for this I'm gonna read Leaping Wolf by J.P. Harker, which is book 2 in the Caledonian Saga. There are companion books. In the first book you follow Rhian Wyn. She comes from a tribe. She is ready to give up fighting and become a wife and a mother. Then the Romans come and invade Welsh. It's kind of sort of Welsh basically, and they invade their land and she has to go back to fighting. And I really enjoyed the first book. It was a really solid 4 stars, and the author was really kind enough to send me the sequels as well, so I'm gonna link down below where you can support the author and buy these books on Amazon. He is self-published. This second book, you follow a character that was present in the first book. It was really interesting, and he's from another barbarian tribe, and I remember him from the first book and I want to see what happens to him. He's definitely military based. the military aspects and elements in first book were really prominent and really well detailed. So if you're somebody who enjoys that kind of things in fantasy, definitely check this series out. Fantasy with paranormal elements in it, and I chose a really peculiar one, I would say, which is Miserere by Teresa Frock. Now, this book I found in a list of books that were so fucked up they couldn't be made into a movie. And basically, I believe this is about this man. He is an exorcist, and he at one point has to go to hell, and he has to choose between saving his girlfriend or saving his sister. And he chooses his sister. Turns out it's a bad choice. So he leaves his lover in hell, gets his sister back, and the sister is not really grateful, and the sister is kind of bonkers and wants to raise hell on earth or something of the sort. I think I've stopped reading the synopsis at one point because I think it's one of those annoying synopses where it tells you all the story, which why? But sounds super fucked up, super weird. I've heard it's one of that sticks with you, and hopefully I love it. It sounds right up my alley, so. Chose Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant, just because I keep hearing people speak about these, and I'm just curious. I think it's about sirens, but they're not really the kind mermaids singing and, you know, beautiful mermaid that we are used to. And I think these sirens are gonna be mean as hell. So I believe, you know, there's a crew. They kind of go to this lake or to investigate this mermaid, with sirens. They never come back. So after a bunch of months, years, a new crew is sent out to find out what happens. And I heard this is definitely crude and brutal and horror-ish. So I'm here for it. Our protagonists have a quest, and you follow them in their quest. Kings of the Wild. Now, I did not find this in any list, so this is I chose that this was fitting the category, and because I wanted to read this really badly, so let's go with it. But it sounds like all right, because this is about a bunch of mercenaries that are now old, retired, and they have to come together again to save the daughter of one of them and go on this quest to rescue her. So as you can see, this is about a quest. Fantasy where there are portals to other worlds, back in time, whether it is. For this, I've got In an Absent Dream by Shannon McGuire, and continue on with the series, and this is about children that travel to magic worlds, and each child travel to a different world with its peculiarities, and then when they come back they cannot fit in the normal world anymore, so they are recruited by this lady and brought to her boarding school where they can kind of adjust again to society, or if they're lucky, get back to their world. And in each book you follow a different character. Some books I think though you go back to old characters, but anyway, in this you follow Landy. I'm just gonna say this because again this is not the first book in the series, so looking forward to continue on with these short and yet really weird, I love them, books. Fantasy with a lot of romance elements in it, and I chose to go with Hagis Daughter by Sarah Douglas. I owned this for a really long while, and I love Greek mythology, really love it. And I think this takes place in an alternative, again, history setting where Troy has fallen, and now the daughter or granddaughter of someone involved, I believe the granddaughter of Ariadne. I think this is a really lengthy series with a lot of romance elements and, you know, war, betrayal and all of that, but it's definitely, there's a lot of romantic elements in it for sure from the synopsis, which it's really convoluted and complicated, so I'm not gonna go into much. But yeah, you will follow the events after the Trojan War of our, you know, of the descendant of our beloved heroes, and the madness they get themselves into, I guess. We'll see. science fantasy, sci-fi. For these I chose Roadside Picnic by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, and I think this is about this man. He travels back and forth the zone, which is this area, this alien area, I guess, where he can find specific artifacts that he then sells on the black market, and he takes his daughter with him every time, and at one point his daughter gets changed by the zone, and I think he wants to go back there and try to save his daughter, I believe. I don't know, I heard this is weird and sounds amazing, so I'm gonna read this and let you know. Literally any of the books I've just mentioned, apart from probably The Little Prince, which is a standalone, but a fantasy series that's made of more than one book, and I chose to just tackle one series that I'm in the middle of and I cannot wait to continue, which is The Dragon Republic by R.F. Kuang. This is the second book. The first book, Ryu Folurunin, she comes from really poor background and she studies a lot to get into this elite military school, and she goes there and war comes as well, and Runin is one of the best main characters I've ever read about. This is definitely also grim dark fantasy, 100%, and I cannot wait to see what she's up to. And I think this is also based on the rape of Nanking. It's also based on a bunch of different wars and atrocities that happen in history in Asia, and it's so good. It's so good, but you've heard about this a million times, so you don't need me to go into details about this. I'm so looking forward to this in preparation for the third and believe final book. Fantasy with steampunk elements. I chose The Bone Shaker by Cherry Priest, and I believe this is about Ezekiel. Ezekiel wants to avenge his father after he went into disgrace. His father was a scientist who invented the Bone Shaker, this really powerful machine to drill into Alaskan ice, but unfortunately the machine malfunctions, puncturing through the ground in Seattle and leaking this gas that turns most of Seattle population into living dead, some of the sort. So we might have zombies as well. So I guess all the people had to flee, and now Ezekiel wants to go back in the city and avenge his father. I don't know why he'd go back. I get you love your father. I'd never get back in a city full of zombies though, but who am I to decide, you know? Fantasy that has superheroes in it. I chose for these, I am not a fan of books about superheroes. So Firefight by Brandon Sanderson is the second book in a trilogy by him, where basically you got some people that are not superheroes. David, I think, is our main protagonist, and David is set on getting revenge on a really famous superhero that everybody loves. And it reminds me of The Boys on Amazon Prime and The Boys, the comic, which I've read before watching the TV show on Amazon Prime. Absolutely love the TV show. It's one of the best TV shows I've seen recently. And I mean, again, this was a prompt, so I had to choose one. I'm glad that it gives me a chance to actually continue with the series. I did enjoy the first book enough. I think it was like 4 stars. Which is a miracle because every other book about superheroes don't really enjoy. It's comics hit or miss, but books format usually never works. So this one worked well enough, and I'm glad I'll continue on. Now, this wasn't necessarily a pirate fantasy. I looked and I went on a list and I chose a book that actually I already own. Now, I wanted to also read the sequel to The Lies of Locke Lamora, but I didn't own it, and instead I owned Theft of Swords by Michael J. Sullivan. I already owned this, and I decided, you know, to buy as little as possible. I literally just bought the Crimson Campaign and The Little Prince for these because I literally own nothing that would fit that category, but because these fit in the category, and it's about, you know, out of fantasy with a lot of mayhem and adventure and swashbuckling, I guess. It's about these two guys that are friends. One is a thief, one is a mercenary, and they cause a lot of trouble, I guess. Speaking of excuse, fantasy that basically takes place in our world, it's a urban fantasy, so it's a fantasy in a city in an urban setting. And again, the excuse come from Sarah J. Maas book Crescent City, Out of Earth and Blood, I think it's called, the series. And I've not read this yet, which is a fairly recent release, and this was perfect for this. This is urban fantasy, adult urban fantasy, and I believe this is about Bryce. Bryce lost her friends due to the atrocious acts of a serial killer. The killer is brought to justice, and after 2 years though, this killing starts happening again, but the supposed killer is in prison, and I think Bryce gets involved again in the investigation on these crimes and what actually happened. So I've heard amazing things. I've heard he's a hot guy, as usually in all Sarah J. Maas. I'm here for it. Urban fantasy, it fits. Let's go with it. Fantasy with vampires in it, and I chose to go with actually an horror for this, and this is The Let the Right One In by John Advi Ludquist. I don't know, I'm butchering that. And I don't know anything about this. I've not watched the movie. I know it's a horror though, and I believe this is about this boy who lives with his mother kind of in the middle of nowhere, and then all of a sudden a girl moves next door, but she doesn't leave the house, she doesn't go to school, she's really weird, and it turns out that she is a vampire, something of a sort. I'm looking forward to this. Fantasy targeted at young adults, and for this I chose Kethura and Lord Death by Martine Levitt. One of the first books I've acquired when I started watching booktube, and I believe this is about this girl that tells stories that fascinates even Lord Death himself. But I could be totally wrong because the synopsis is really vague, and I'm okay with it. It's short. I've heard this won also some awards, and I'm definitely looking forward to this. I could have chosen other more popular series, to be fair, than this, but I'm really intrigued by this, and I want to give it a try. So I'm surprised this actually didn't take me as long as I thought it was gonna take. I hope I was clear enough with the synopsis as best as I could. Thinking about doing an haul and maybe a manga version of this, or like a graphic novel manga version of this. Thank you for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day, what's left by the time you finish watching this. I'll see you next time. Ciao.